Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, where we expose the mysteries of executive function. As you know, executive function is one's ability to manage self in the context of the world by understanding who we are, what our strengths and challenges, what our mission and goals are, and how to put effort to meet the purpose of your life. However, children, as you can imagine, are still in the process of discovering what their purpose should be, and they're very much dependent on adults to guide them. And two important characteristics that strike me in that aid the process of enhancing and exfoliating, I like to call executive function, is kindness and compassion. And today we are going to talk to two most beautiful people who have taken their life's commitment and wrapped it in a beautiful book. But we're going to talk about my favorite icon or human being, Mr. Fred Rogers. So before I introduce them, I just want to kind of share this, that Webster's Dictionary lists following synonyms for the word imagination: creativity, imaginativeness, creativeness, vision, inspiration, inventiveness, invention, resourcefulness, ingenuity, originality, innovation, and innovativeness. Executive function refers to adaptive resourcefulness one needs to exercise one's own skills and actions to attain goals, persist, and act in a way that moves you through the world in a collaborative and cooperative mindset. You can pursue your goals in a selfish way. While you are pursuing and attaining your goals, you may be harming other people or blocking other people's ability to achieve goals, and that's not good executive function. And people with strong executive function tend to be more creative, resourceful, and adept in not just solving problems, but directing attention and effort to do the same for themselves so that they are a contributing member. And with that in mind, today it's my privilege to introduce Gregg Behr and Ryan Rydzewski. So let me start with Gregg. And Gregg is the executive director of the Grable Foundation. He's a father and children's advocate whose work is inspired by his hero, Fred Rogers. You can see this is how you really pay homage to your hero. Write a book about him. And for more than a decade, he has helped lead Remake Learning, a network of educators, scientists, artists, and makers he founded in 2007 to international renown. Formed in Rogers' real-life neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Remake Learning has turned heads everywhere, from Forbes to the World Economic Forum, for its effort to ignite children's curiosity, encourage creativity, and foster justice and belonging in schools, libraries, museums, and more. There's a lot more to talk about him, but let's pay attention to Ryan. And Ryan Rydzewski, he is a writer whose science and education reporting has garnered several awards and fellowships. He's a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh. He taught elementary school in South Louisiana before earning his MFA in nonfiction writing from Chatham University. He is a freelancer, and his magazine stories focus on everything from school to space travel to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And his poems and other pieces appear in several journals. So welcome to both of you. How are you today?
We're great. It's such a privilege to be here alongside you, Sucheta. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's going to be a wonderful conversation. I already feel it. So before I start talking about our topic today, the book that you have both written, let's start with you two. What has made you curious, or can you tell a little bit of origin story of your own curiosity as little children, maybe?
Well, I'm going to talk about it as a big kid.
Oh, yes.
So this is Gregg. You mentioned in your introduction that I'm a dad. And I mention this because I feel like once my daughters were born about a decade ago, I started learning again what it means to be playful and to wonder and to draw upon some of those curiosities from childhood, a behavior that maybe I unlearned a little bit, and that they have taught me to learn again and to value as an adult. And so when I think about curiosity and curiosities, I think we have layers in our lives and chapters in our lives. And my daughters have opened up a whole new chapter for me about thinking big thoughts and imagining possibilities in the world.
I really like that, because I think let's not just restrict curiosity and imagination to children. I think it should be a lifelong process. I appreciate that. How about you, Ryan?
I think for me, certainly it started in childhood. I was luckily enough to be surrounded by so many great books. For me, it really started with reading. And it started reading with, yes, some of your typical children's books, but I had a grandfather who was very into things like National Geographic. And so I grew up reading that and Time magazine when I was in like fourth grade, which was unusual reading material for a kid, but I think it instilled wonder about the world. And I can still remember reading about things like the capybaras, these little animals in Madagascar. I can remember reading about, the Challenger explosion. I can remember reading about all these things in the world that I can trace my interests as an adult back to reading those books and seeing those pictures and just realizing how much was out there and how much more I wanted to know about it all.
You both remind me of Jonathan Gottschall, who's written stories of, I forget the title of his book, but he has written 10 ways stories dominate your life. And he talks about that, these dreams and religion, song, fantasies, video games, TV commercials, and even conspiracy theories, nonfiction and life stories. And I love that so many ways we can be influenced, but sounds like you were very open, not just as children, but adults. So since we are going to focus our conversation about on the book that you wrote, When You Wonder, You're Learning, Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, and Caring Kids. First question is, what's your relationship with Mr. Rogers and why write a book?
Well, first and foremost, Ryan and I are both Western Pennsylvania kids. So I mention that to say because Fred Rogers, too, was a Western Pennsylvania kid. And he happened to produce his iconic television show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, right here in Pittsburgh at WQED Television, America's first public television station. And Ryan and I had the privilege of watching that show as we were growing up, watching it alongside our families. And in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, we saw our own communities, our own houses, our own community centers, our own art centers. I don't think we realized that at the time, but certainly as adults looking back, it was our neighborhood that we had the privilege of watching. I did have the great opportunity to meet Fred Rogers as an adult. And then Ryan and I have both had the privilege, too, of working alongside and with some of the extraordinary people that worked with Mr. Rogers on what was then called Family Communications. Today is called Fred Rogers Productions. And so we've got to know Fred through his contemporaries who did the work with him. And then maybe in a personal way, we had the privilege of getting to know Joanne Rogers, Mrs. Rogers, who was extraordinary in her own right, couldn't possibly have been a better champion for us and for this book. And how lucky we are that she wrote the foreword for this book that we've written. And one of our deep regrets about this year is that she passed away and we didn't get to give that final production piece to her, especially given how much she had done to support us.
Wow.
One of the things that has been most moving, upon the release of this book is when we talk about this book to people in Pittsburgh, everybody has a Fred story. Everybody, people who grew up here, they knew him. He was their actual neighbor. And so everybody, they share with us these little moments where maybe they met Fred in an elevator or at a fundraiser. And Fred will remember a little detail about their life. And 6 months later, they'll get a note from him referencing that moment that they met. He recognized, I think Fred has such a whole emotional hold on all of us because he recognized how much those little moments matter. So we're extraordinarily grateful to have had him. And in many ways, I think he's with us still.
Well, I think that's going to time into the next question I'm going to ask you, because Fred Rogers is a legend, and what I see is a kickstart of a renaissance of Fred Rogers' philosophy. And so let's start there. Fred Rogers is less of a TV host, even though he produced more than 900 shows. He's an author, but less of an author because he's more of something else I'm about to say, and commencement speeches and so many other things. But what he was he was almost a learning scientist. He was almost an educational specialist, and truly, his background tells it all. But to me, he was a polymath. He was a musician. He was a music writer. He was a composer. He directed. He wrote the scripts, and he produced. So, let's start there. Who was Mr. Rogers as an individual, and what strikes you about his approach? But only a polymath can do that, because he was not so tunnel vision, right?
He was, I like that word, polymath. He was a generalist. He was extraordinarily talented in a number of fields because, he really put a lot of work in. You mentioned earlier that he was a musician. So Fred Rogers, born in Latrobe, which is a small town sort of right outside Pittsburgh, went to undergraduate to learn piano, music composition. Then he enrolled in what became the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, studied religion, studied philosophy. And while he was there, he also studied at the Arsenal Children's Center, which at the time, this was in the late 1950s, folks like Benjamin Spock and Erik Erikson and Rogers' mentor, Margaret McFarland, some of the top learning scientists in the world, these were psychologists and psychiatrists and pediatricians, they all happened to be working in Pittsburgh at the same time. And in walks a young Fred Rogers, bringing his music background, bringing his religious and his philosophical background, learning the science, and then blending it with this beautiful art, with puppetry, with set design, with songs and stories, building what became Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I think without that generalist background, without that polymath tendency that you mentioned, I don't know that we would have the neighborhood, because it really is rooted in all of those. And of course, we remember the art, music, and how he made us feel. What our book hopefully does is elucidate that everything he did on that program, everything he did in the neighborhood, was grounded in science. And it was grounded in science that was not only cutting edge for his day, it's still applicable, maybe even more so today.
And Sucheta, that deserves to be underlined. You yourself used the phrase learning scientist. I don't think most of us that have that memory of Fred Rogers think of him as a learning scientist. We think of him as that warm, loving person on the other side of our screens. I think today we think of him as an American icon, and certainly recent films and biographies have contributed to that sense of legacy. And Fred Rogers was a learning scientist. We didn't use those words decades ago. I'm not even sure there were formal fields of study in higher education in what we're learning about learning itself with the learning sciences. But to hear those names of individuals with whom Fred Rogers studied or from whom he benefited, that is a Mount Rushmore of child development specialists of the 20th century. And his work springs right from their instruction, their guidance, the atmosphere for learning that they created for him. And it was that deliberate and intentional scientific approach that he took to his work that was so pivotal, and that really is the basis and the aha for our book, that Fred Rogers was a learning scientist.
I think you said it, deliberate and intentional. Nothing, it may sound off the cuff, simple remark, but everything was very thoughtful and deeply connected to some principle of learning, even though even though it never would occur to people because of the simplicity. So I like the way, I like you just the way you are, is what Mr. Rogers said to each and every child in the neighborhood. There are three principles to me that strike me, considering my own background as a specialist who teaches children to learn how to learn. Number one was express your feelings openly and freely, which he says, I like you. To tell somebody I like you is quite intimidating. Two is this capacity to observe, that ability to see the other person fully, just the way. I love that his capacity. He was so authentic. That's the word that often is described. And lastly, the unconditional acceptance, or the ability to meet others wherever they are. So no wonder people called him emotional archaeologist. So how do adults charged to teach and raise children imbibe these principles?
Ryan, do you want to take that first as a former teacher?
Well, it's a good question. It's a big question. And I think you started with your first principle, express yourself freely. Fred used to say that anything that's mentionable can become more manageable.
Oh, I love that.
And even though we tend to remember the neighborhood as this sort of happy, warm, comfortable place, we sometimes forget. And in fact, it really didn't strike Greg and I until we went back to watch so many of these episodes. There are some hard things in the neighborhood. Fred talked about racism. Fred talked about war. Fred talked about death and divorce. He didn't hide the hard realities of the world from children. But what he did do was make them feel safe enough to express their feelings about it. He made them feel safe enough to be shy about it. He made them feel safe enough, again, to be fully who they are. Because I think, if we show children that their emotions aren't okay, if we show children that we're going to judge them for the way they feel, for having these big emotions over which they have no control and sometimes no understanding of why they're feeling a certain way, then they're not going to share them. We're never going to get to the root of why children are feeling the way they are. I think Fred's message, I like you just the way you are, I like it because it's simple, but it's somewhat revolutionary. It's very brave. It's easy to say, yes, we're going to like everyone just the way they are, but then spend some time with that person. You're not always going to like them in that moment. What Fred tells kids, what Fred tells everybody, is that all of you, your happy moments, your proud moments, and your angry moments, and your sad moments, it's all okay. We can all bring those fully human emotions to whatever situation we happen to be in, and it's okay. We're not going to judge one another for our feelings. We're going to make each other feel safe enough to be able to talk about those feelings. And I think that's what made the neighborhood so powerful. And I think it's a large reason why we all have such fond feelings for it today, because for a lot of us, we weren't always told that our feelings were okay. Fred himself used to say that he grew up in a household where anger was not okay. So what do you do with an angry feeling if you're not allowed to express it? Fred really helped kids work through issues like that. And to watch him at work and to understand the science and the principles he was using in the neighborhood, it's to watch a master at work.
What I love so much about that simple phrase that we all remember, I like you just the way you are, can be encapsulated in one word, and that's noticing. Essentially, Fred was saying, I notice you.
Yeah.
And to Ryan's comments, when you say, I notice you, that means I respect you. And I respect your big feelings and your big questions and your little feelings and your little questions. Yeah. I'm going to give you a sense of safety. This is a safe place. I notice you. You're safe here. You belong here. And it's those sensibilities that one conveys in that phrase, I like you just the way you are. Now, I think it's important because there's been criticism over the years as if that doesn't mean you don't have work to do or there's not hard work to do, right? That wasn't what Fred was saying. He's saying, I notice you, I respect you, and we're in a place that we're going to learn together. And we're going to work hard at that and practice at that. I think some people have taken that phrase, I like you just the way you are, as somehow conveying like, you don't need to do anything more.
Yeah, it's different from saying you're perfect. It's different from saying everything you think, everything you do is okay, or everything you think, everything you do is great. Fred never did that. What he did tell children by saying, I like you just the way you are, is that I am never going to reject your humanity. I'm never going to reject your full, complicated self. And it's in that acceptance. It's in that not rejecting children that we can begin to do that work that Greg mentioned to get to wherever it is that we want to be.
And I tell you, this is a lifelong process. It doesn't apply to children, right? I love this play that came in '90s. You remember, I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. I don't know if you remember that play.
Yes.
It was a comedy, but I do see that, I see a tug between parents and children. Parents feel leniency somehow is excessive permissiveness. They just do not understand accepting the entirety of a person and being with that, as you said, humanity of somebody, but not lowering your expectation are totally two different processes.
Yes.
They don't short sell one over the other. And I think that's just the real art. I just see more demand or clarity of, setting rules and being firm as a sign of loving. I hit you because I love you. It's like that kind of, and so, I think last question I had about this particular topic before we start talking about curiosity, is this making children believe that unconditional acceptance that you matter to me. Do you think it's lame? I know the answer, but the educators, why do we not see that in abundance in educational context? Why educational environments are so sterile when it comes to love?
We see it in abundance in the classrooms and libraries and after-school programs of master educators. They get it, right?
Yes.
And we used this phrase earlier about the atmosphere for learning, in which Fred Rogers was immersed at the Arsenal Children's Center with those 20th century child development experts. What great educators do is exactly that, is they create an atmosphere for learning, because they recognize that we can't even start to think about creativity and curiosity and working together. We can't even start to think about those types of pursuit of those skills and those mindsets unless we create conditions where kids feel psychologically and physically safe, where they do feel like they belong, where they feel like their questions are respected, where they feel like they are loved, and as Fred Rogers said, loved and capable of loving. That grounding is fundamental. And so often today it's talked about in terms of social and emotional learning. And it's that and so much more. It really is about creating that environment for learning where there's that level of, I'm here, I belong here, I have a sense of agency here. Now what can we do?
So do you both agree politeness is not kindness?
I do.
Because there's a lot of emphasis on that. Yeah.
Sure. I love Fred's message of kindness. I love, how nice Fred could seem. But I think there's a difference between being kind or just being nice and showing your humanity. That's what we talked to someone in the book named Dr. Aisha White.
Yes, I love that.
She says, we can't gloss over hard things just because we want to be nice to each other. In fact, by glossing over hard things, I think we're doing a disservice. We want to be nice. We want to be kind. But more than anything, we want to recognize the humanity in one another. Yeah. That's not always kind in the way that we think of it, but ultimately, I think it's the kindest thing we can do for one another.
So Cheta, I've never been asked that question before. And it's so interesting because as Ryan was speaking, I was thinking as an adult, right? You go to community meetings, you go to business meetings, and in these parts of the world, we call it Pittsburgh polite. I'm sure they call it different things in different cities.
We live in the South, so we are very polite.
But in the context of being polite, we're not being kind because we're not surfacing the hard questions that we deserve to ask of ourselves and each other. And we can do so in a civil, respectful, responsible way. But we're not doing the work of kindness and humanity by merely glossing over what is hard and difficult, because life is complex and people are complex.
Great. So let's talk about creativity then. So for starters, how do you define creativity or this sense of wonder? And when it comes to Fred Rogers, his ability to invoke this sense of wonder, how and when did it show up in his work? And why did he put that as the center stage of his work?
I have a brief response and then I'll let Ryan go. So you used all sorts of synonyms at the beginning of the production, Sucheta, and it makes me think, I think of the word innovation when I think of creativity and curiosity, which are certainly close cousins, right? And we have some colleagues, in fact, we cite the work of Melissa Butler, who's this extraordinary kindergarten teacher. We cite her in the book. And she, among others, refers to this sensibility that innovation is finding something new in something familiar.
I love that.
And I like that phrasing when I think about creativity. Creativity is, it's going through that scenario planning. It's that adaptive thinking that we talk about, and it's finding something new and something familiar.
Great definition. How about you, Ryan?
We see a lot of that in the neighborhood. When Fred, there's a whole week that we talk about in the book. Fred called it Creativity Week. It was Mr. Rogers talks about creativity, and he starts this 5-episode series about creativity with a spoon, just a regular spoon that you might find in your kitchen. Now, that might seem like an unusual choice. If this is going to be Creativity Week, why don't we bring in something wild, something a little bit more fantastic, something a little bit more mysterious? But Rogers knew that we have to start with things that we know. We see this in all kinds of episodes. Whenever we go off and do a creative project, it starts with something that's familiar. It starts with a sandbox. It starts with water. It starts with a spoon. It starts with something that's familiar to children and their environment. And from there, we can build. From there, we can start making up stories. What are some things a spoon can be? Well, over the course of those 5 episodes, a spoon becomes an inspiration for an opera. A spoon becomes a musical instrument. A spoon becomes a tool for making mountains in the neighborhood of make-believe. Rogers knew that creativity really springs from a blend of what's familiar a blend of mystery with what's familiar, something new inside something that's familiar, as Gregg said. We see that in just about every episode of The Neighborhood.
And this is the beauty of where Fred Rogers, as the learning scientist, made that so seamless, right? Because we didn't recognize that in the work. It's not what we remember. And it's what great learning engineers do is they make that learning science so seamless. But the learning science now tells us today that people don't jump from idea A to idea Z. They start with what comes next, B, right? They go to something familiar. And so whether Fred Rogers is using a spoon or a lampshade or something else that's familiar in kids' lives, that's as true, Sucheta, for a child as it is for an adult. As we think about what's possible, we sometimes get paralyzed when we jump to something that seems impossible. But when you start to see something new and something that's familiar to you, then you connect familiarity and mystery in brilliant ways.
The other thing he did was he helped show children that their creative passions, their creative ideas, their creative questions, he showed kids that creativity has value. And he did that all sorts of ways. And sometimes it was just the way he modeled behavior. There's a quote in the book, it was from like a television critic at the time who said, when Fred sits down and he's cutting out construction paper or he's painting a picture, he acts as if he'd be doing that anyway, even if he weren't on television. He shows children that what he's doing brings him joy. Yes. And then he brings in all these creative guest stars. Sometimes they're creative professionals. It's Yo-Yo Ma, it's Wynton Marsalis, it's Julia Child. But more often, it's everyday people in the neighborhood. Every adult in the neighborhood has some sort of creative passion that he or she does not feel pressured to give up. So Officer Clemens, the neighborhood police officer, was also the neighborhood opera singer. Handyman Negri was the neighborhood guitarist. Aubrey Cleans Everything, who ran the cleaning business, was the neighborhood cheerleading squad leader. Everybody had a creative passion. Everybody indulged it. And in doing so, I think Rogers was able to show children that their creativity has value, not only for them, but creativity makes life better for their neighbors too.
And what I noticed in his work is the beginning always would be to show children one's own interest. So children would never think a spoon can be interesting, right? So you kind of say, spoon, I know you've been using it, but I'm going to study it. Like his purple violets, like the little pot with purple violets, right? And then second is because to me, innovation is towards the end. It leads to innovation. But the seeds of that is to first observe, which requires you to pause and not do other things. So if you think spoon is predictable, there's no reason to do anything new with the spoon, right? So I love the way he would help children actually walk on that bridge. And so I want to ask you a question about his capacity and ability, which he modeled all the time, is this ability to observe. So I was in the research, Fred's first job was as a producer of Gabby Hayes' children's show, where this cowboy would talk to the children, even though it was kind of weird, as you know, and directly though by looking into the camera. So he had, so Fred became very curious about this method and asked Gabby Hayes, how do you find comfort in this? This is a very awkward way. And Gabby Hayes says, remember, Fred, one buckaroo. There's one buckaroo behind this peephole of a camera that you're looking at. And that really set the stage of this directly talking, which is now we would call it breaking the fourth dimension, I guess. Right? So what do you think about this one strategy that he used, and how can we adapt that to when we are interacting with children, that direct gaze and seeing people with that, or paying attention to them by directly looking at the camera? Do you think that played an important role in this process?
Oh, it absolutely did. And the mere fact that he called the experience a television visit.
Yes.
It's the way you and I are looking at each other through a screen right now. He did think about one little buckaroo on the other side of that, and famously called it a holy space between me and that viewer. And it's interesting. Ryan and I have had the privilege of talking to modern multimedia folks, people who are creating video games for kids, or people who are developing other types of multimedia technologies to engage in this experience. And that's essentially what Fred did, right? He took the newfangled technology of his day, television, and said, how do I make it constructive and good? And it's a real sincere challenge to not only to that teacher or whomever is in that direct physical presence, to be present to the learner, but for those who are creating products and devices and software, how do we take that same sensibility and think about it in the same way, so that we are supporting you and your passions and your interests, and helping you bump up against the things that you need to bump up against?
Yeah, and that sort of eye gaze that you mentioned, it just reminded me of what Greg said earlier. If the point of the show was telling children, I notice you, it's hard to do better than to look directly at a person and speak directly to that person. Recently, my fourth grade niece watched the program for the first time. My wife's family didn't grow up watching Mr. Rogers. This was all new to her when we started writing the book. But now, we have some little kids on that side of the family, and they're watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And she was watching her first episode, and not 5 minutes in, she turned to her mom and said, Mom, how does he know how to talk to me? And she was thrilled. She was thrilled that this person on the other side of the screen was looking right at her and talking to her. And Rogers did that in other ways too. He always had the eye gaze. But whenever a new person would appear on the set, say Mr. McFeely, the speedy delivery man, he would always introduce that person he would say, this is my television neighbor, meaning the viewer. At every point, the viewer was included. I think we write in the book, the viewer was treated as a collaborator. Kids were always being noticed. Kids were always being brought into the experience of the neighborhood and told that they matter.
Interestingly, I heard Joanne Rogers tell a story that once they were coming out of a New York hotel, and a kid ran into Mr. Rogers, and his first question was, how did you get out? How did you get out? And so she said he sat on got to his eye level, started explaining, about the TV show. And she said after he finished, everybody would think he got it. And then the kid ends by saying, how are you going to get back in? So he didn't understand. So you're right. Like that, that spaces you share with people can give a great sense of satisfaction and closeness. So the next question.
Sucheta, I have to interrupt you because in relaying that story, there's another really critical part. It's not just Fred Rogers noticing that moment and talking directly to that child on that street, but you said getting down at his level.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's also the physical presence, and how we physically present ourselves to others is so critically important.
And Fred always did that. There's a quick anecdote in the book of, he's rushing through an airport with Bill Eisler, who is a close colleague of ours who really helped us get this book off the ground. He worked closely with Fred for years, and no matter the situation, so Fred always got down, like Greg said, on one knee. He always got down at children's eye level. And in the book, we talk with Bill Eisler, who was Fred's close colleague for years, traveled all over the country with Fred. And no matter the situation, even if they were late for a flight, Fred would get down, get on eye level with a child. And I heard somebody recently say, imagine looking up at everyone all the time. Imagine just the physical act of having to crane your head and look up at all the people around you. After a while, that's got to get really tiring. So there's also, again, that sense of physical comfort that Fred conveyed by meeting children literally where they are.
Yeah, and you say this a funny story. There was another Bill Eisler story that he says they had hired this crew for the Fred Rogers production, and they were navigating, New York traffic or whatever, and on the foot they were trying to get to the shoot, and a homeless man hollered at Mr. Rogers and stopped him, and like everybody should, ignore the homeless man. Fred Rogers said, no, he has spoken to him. So he takes that $5 bill, gives it to the homeless man, and then gets on his knees and sits and starts talking to the homeless man. And then that went on for 20 minutes. And here Bill Eisler is like sweating because he's like, we have all these people we have paid, but that was Fred Rogers, very much recognizing the humanity in every opportunity you get. And, that's another remarkable thing that comes through your book is he was not two different people. He was one, like Joanne said, right? You see what you get, or you get what you see. And that's so hard to be that way. We're nice when we are required to. Then we're like, I'm taking a vacation from niceness.
Well, it's so hard to be. And as you just mentioned, Joanne, as she wrote in the foreword to our book, no one worked harder at being Fred Rogers than did Fred Rogers. It was a practiced behavior. And he awoke in the morning thinking through, what is my day going to be? With whom am I going to interact? What is the presence that I want to have to these individuals? How do I want to go about my day? It was it goes back to deliberate and intentional way of being in the world. And then, that he was one person. Maybe he wasn't one person on our television sets and another one at the elevator or bakery where fellow Pittsburghers ran into him, as Ryan was describing. He was who we needed him to be. And I think that's partly too why in his death, and then thinking about his legacy deserves so much attention, because at his core, he was a decent, good human being.
Oh, yes. And I miss him so much. It sounds very corny, but I just cannot believe he's no longer here. The other thought came to my mind was this, there was a story that I think was written in a tribute. Esquire magazine did a tribute on him, and it says Mr. Rogers wanted to meet Coco the gorilla, who had been taught the sign language, and nobody would be allowed in her enclosed area except Mr. Rogers was, she let him in, but not only she recognized him and she had seen him, she gave him a big hug, and then she proceeded to remove his shoes. You wrote about.
Can you imagine that moment?
It was so endearing. So I want to ask you about value of routines and rituals when we work with children, and how does that connect with invoking this sense of wonder in them, while kind of, it may sound too simplistic, but there's some profound, setting the tone or reducing the dial. Is that how you see it?
Sure. Yeah. I think the routines in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which began and ended the same way for about almost 40 years, were an expression of Rogers' attempts to make sure children felt safe. There's a feeling of safety when you walk into a place that you recognize very well, whether it's your home, whether it's a library, versus walking into a place you've never been before, or standing in a crowd of people you don't know. Rogers knew that feeling that sense of safety was absolutely critical. It is absolutely critical to helping children and adults, for that matter, learn. Anxiety has been shown, and you probably read some of this research, to diminish our executive function, to diminish our ability to learn. Rogers knew that it's so important that the environment in which children are in feels safe. So whenever something moved, whenever something was at one part of the set to the other, Rogers always explained why it was going to move. When I think it was in the early 1970s, Mr. Rogers' walls, which are iconically blue, early on they were yellow, and Rogers painted them. We saw Rogers painting them, and there are several scenes of Rogers sitting there watching paint dry, because he knew children, again, they need routine and they need time to process things. All of this comes from a place of wanting to make sure children felt safe.
And it's funny because I think we don't do that to children. I remember talking to one of my clients, and the parents were changing schools without informing the child. And the child, just was revealed a week before the child was going to a completely new school. They were yanking the kid from a public school to private school, but the kid was never onboarded or discussed or invited. And this is a middle school kid. So I can imagine that trauma of like, oh, what is happening to me and why? None of those. And so that goes back to talking about respect. So let's talk about, you've been very kind to us as readers, that every chapter you ended with tools for invoking or propelling curiosity. So can you walk us through the one that's most important to you, and the ones that you think are really we need to prioritize these important processes? What are your recommendations for our listeners, in addition to reading the book, of course?
So as you say, we conclude each chapter by just giving some very practical examples that you or I and Ryan might create in our own homes, on the streets in our neighborhoods, in our classrooms, libraries, wherever we might be in the presence of children and young people. And some of the ideas are curated from some of the people we had the privilege to talk to. So one of those people was Hedda Sherpin. Hedda is a remarkable educator who began work on production with Mr. Rogers back in 1968 with that first episode. And she relayed the story of having gone into a teacher's classroom and seeing at the front of the classroom a wicker basket that the teacher called an ask-it basket.
Love that.
And the idea was that she had created an environment, the kids asked questions, and when kids asked questions, which she invited, she acknowledged the questions, however crazy she thought they might be, or however on point she thought they might be. She would take the time to notice them. She would write it down on a piece of paper, put it in the ask-it basket, and would announce that we'll find time later to answer these questions, and then would go back, respecting those questions, and answer the questions, and would do it collectively. To me, that's a simple tactic that I could do with my daughters in our kitchen in the evenings. I also think, too, of the personal things that we might draw upon from our own lives. And so I think of the early days of the pandemic. And I had shared with Ryan, and it ended up in the book, that we, in the early days of the pandemic, I'd gone out into the garage. I found my old skateboard. So thinking of passions and interests, I used to be a skateboarder as a young kid. And I pulled out my skateboard and I started skating down the street. And you could imagine how I was laughing and giggling as a nearly 50-year-old man back on a skateboard I hadn't stepped on in 30 years, at least. And the thing about that is that the kids on the street started running behind me. And you can imagine how they're like cheering and they thought it was goofy. But today there are 8 girls in our street who are skateboarders. Now, I'm smart enough to say I can't draw a line between A and B, but it's a pretty good line, even if zigzagged, because what they witnessed was an adult showing something that interests him, provoking curiosity in them to say like, oh, I wonder what that's like to get on a skateboard and go down the street, and finding that it was something that they enjoyed and enjoyed doing together.
Absolutely.
And so that's 2 of dozens of examples that we try and express at the end of each chapter in the theme of that chapter.
By the way, basket is my favorite strategy, by the way.
It's such a good one. It really is such a great, and it's so replicable. Like, it's so practical.
Ryan, how about you? Any strategies that speak to you?
I think my favorite one, and we quote actually David Epstein, who wrote a great book called Range, which is about the importance of being a generalist in a specialized world. But what David talks about is the Saturday morning experiment, just an opportunity to try something new. You don't have to like it. You don't have to pursue it any further than that one day, but just an opportunity to try something different. And I love that advice because I think it mirrors what Fred did in The Neighborhood so well. I mean, you could take any one episode or any, of these 5-episode theme weeks that he did, and the sheer variety that Fred brought into The Neighborhood is astounding. We would go to a garden, we would go to a factory, we would go to a restaurant, we would go to a library, to a museum, sometimes all in the same day, because Fred knew that kids need to be exposed to what he called the smorgasbord of the world, because it's through that exposure, through these opportunities to try new things, that kids can start to discover their passions. Kids can start to discover what they like. And eventually, hopefully, kids will start to find their purpose. And as the research shows, there's nothing more powerful when it comes to learning than a sense of purpose. But it has to be an authentic purpose. It has to be a purpose that is true to you, something that you've chosen. And the only way to find it is to just try as much as you can until it clicks.
Do you have any favorite episode yourselves?
I know what Greg's going to say. Go ahead, Greg.
Well, I know
each other too much.
Yeah, it's true. Ryan's going to say, you're going to say Death of a Goldfish, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah. So go ahead.
All right. So it's a weird one to be a favorite because it's actually incredibly sad. But the episode Death of a Goldfish is Fred's most direct way of talking to children about death. It's extremely moving and it's extremely simple. His goldfish dies and there's no music. If I remember correctly, it's a very quiet episode, even by the neighborhood's already quiet standards. And he goes outside and he buries it. And he talks about the fact that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to miss the friends or the pets that you love. It is a distillation, I think, of everything he did in all his other episodes, of that sense that, what's mentionable becomes more manageable. And he's mentioning in that episode the hardest thing that anybody has to deal with, which is grief. And in doing so, he helps make it more manageable for kids, and I think for adults too.
And for me, there is no one favorite episode. There's a theme that I appreciate, and that theme was the tours. Fred would take us on factory tours to see how musical instruments were made, or he might take us to a fire hall or a construction site. We all remember the visit to the crayon factory.
Yes, which was my favorite.
Yeah, right. So again, something familiar in a kid's life, right? Like, I have this crayon I play with all the time. I drive down the street and we see this construction site. Like, what's actually happening there? And I just love that he recognized that these are the types of things about which kids wonder. And then he took us there and we could see how things were made and what people were doing and what was happening. And he took familiar things and expanded our universes.
Yeah, and my favorite, which again, I agree with you, like, I don't know if I can pick one, but I loved the Curiosity series that he did, the 5 episodes he did. But I also loved the surgery, tonsillectomy, right? Was it not? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just want to get the surgery right. But I thought that was quite wow. Like, we wouldn't, I mean, now children are seeing everything, but the quietness, and in which you seriously are consuming this information, that is going to change the way you look at information and say, okay, this also happens in life, so yeah, that's really great. So that brings me to this last question, which is, it's a really more contemplative than all the other questions, I guess, is, was moved by the last prayer that he heard before his death was Psalm 129, which was read at his memorial service, but which says, and I hope I'm saying it correctly, but I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. So his essence to children was look for the helpers, and eventually be the helper. So can you talk a little bit about that? How does that fit in this equation of helping children become a well-developed, well-adjusted individuals?
You want to start, Greg?
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned this phrase "look for the helpers," which has become so used, and maybe for good and sad reasons. Because as communities, as a nation, we face tragedies, and there's been instruction for us in the depth of tragedy and despair to look to the goodness around that's helping then to address that. Dana Winters, who is the executive director of the Fred Rogers Center at St. Vincent College, just to the east of Pittsburgh, reminds us that there's more to that phrase. And I won't correctly quote it, but the point being that after saying, look to the helpers, Fred Rogers spoke to hope and the importance of hope in our lives as a driver of possibility and healing. And it's not just a matter of looking to the helpers, it's looking to our hope and the hope that we find inside of ourselves and the goodness that we want to create, which reminds me of the challenge that Fred Rogers issued at the Millennium. And that is perhaps the greatest opportunity each of us has is to make goodness attractive.
All right. So, and thank you for mentioning about, children needing helpers and some more than the others. Can we quickly talk about, you do cover childhood challenges, particularly childhood trauma. And I wonder if that was specifically put in there, considering all the new research we know, as well as education. People in education are also becoming aware of the need for addressing mental health. So what are your thoughts about, even though from the era of 50s when Mr. Rogers began, we were barely talking about emotions other than anger, I guess. So we have evolved as a society, but we are also now paying attention to children who may have experienced profound saddening or depressing or anxiety-provoking circumstances.
Yeah, I think the most interesting research around that to us was there's all sorts of new research coming out about how loving, close relationships it's not a panacea, but it can help kids be much more resilient than maybe we had previously thought before. So we talk in the book about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. There's this really exciting field of research into what scientists are calling counter ACEs, these things that counter those adverse childhood experiences. And, if you reduce these things to numbers, which a number of scientists caution against, but for the purposes of our conversations, if you have 2 adverse childhood experiences, it is possible to counteract those with 2 counter ACEs, 2 positive experiences. And when we looked into the research as to, what constitutes a counter ACE, it's things that Fred was doing in the neighborhood. It is establishing routines. It is making sure kids feel safe. It is making sure children have positive experiences with adults, whether or not those adults are the children's parents. A neighbor can be a counter ACE. A teacher can be a counter ACE, a coach. So many of us have an opportunity to be that person for children that Fred was for us.
Lovely.
And that was the neighborhood.
Yes.
Right. We speak often that it wasn't Mr. Rogers' home. It wasn't Mr. Rogers' classroom. It was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And that presence of lots of caring adults is a really critical counter ACE.
I never thought about it until I came across your writing. I thought it was such a casual term, neighborhood, But that was actually such a deliberate choice. You're right. It never said a stage. It never said a room or classroom. And wow. So right off the bat, he's setting the stage for community. You're not an individual. You belong to something larger. So as we end and conclude this fantastic discussion, of course, as you can see, I can go on and on, but I'm being very mindful of your time. Tell us your authors. So have you come across any reading yourself that has influenced you? And would you like to share a book or recommend a book to our audience?
You want to start, Greg?
I love this question, and I've seen Ryan walk out of local bookstores with dozens of books, so I'm so curious what it is that he's going to say. Reflecting on that reference that Fred Rogers made at the Millennium to make goodness attractive, it makes me think of one of my favorite books that I read when I was a college student. It's written by Philip Halley, and the book is entitled "Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed."
Oh, wow.
And it's a book about Nazi-occupied France and how a community made goodness happen in the most horrible of circumstances. And I'm not sure that it's a book in circulation, but it's a book that your listeners should find, whether it's in a used bookstore, their library. It's entitled "Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed." It's a wonderful piece.
Well, thank you. How about you, Ryan?
I want to read that. Thank you, Greg.
Me too. I haven't read that. I read a lot, but I haven't read that.
So I am just about finished with a book by George Saunders, who's a favorite writer of mine. And his latest book is called "A Swim in a Pond in the Rain," in which 4 Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading, and life. And
oh, wow.
I was interested in this book just being a writer. But the book is about so much more than these short stories by these 4 Russian authors. Really what the book does is take us through stories page by page, in some cases line by line, and notice what the brain is doing as we read each passage. What is it that manipulates is an ugly word, but what is it that manipulates a reader to feel a certain way? Why do we read it all? Why do we care about these made up experiences of made up characters? And there's this line in the early part of the book that I have not been able to get out of my head. And George Saunders is talking about the importance of storytelling, the importance of fiction. And he says, short stories are about resistance. They're about the most radical idea of all, that every human being is worthy of attention, and that the origins of every good and evil capability of the universe may be found by observing a single, even very humble person and the turnings of his or her mind.
Wow.
And I love that idea of everybody being worthy of attention. I think that echoes our book, and the idea that the turnings of his or her mind can explain just about everything that happens in the universe. I think there's a deep truth to that. And so I've really been enjoying this book. And I think, as a podcast about executive function, your listeners might like it too.
Well, thank you. Both of you have really given a lot for me to think about, and being so generous to our audience and sharing your wisdom. I really appreciate it. So listeners, if you loved what you hear here, please share, write us a review, and talk to us, email us. I'm easily accessible. So my email is sucheta@exqinfiniteknowhow.com. And thank you, Greg. Thank you, Ryan, for being here with us. And until next time, please be bold, be curious, and remember to have fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.